Welcome to another masterclass here to Mind for All Seasons. Today we're talking about a blueprint for gut health, which is extremely foundational to how our bodies really operate. And to start off with, I want to give an analogy to understand why gut health is so important. Think about our societies. A healthy society requires a lot of different people performing their roles. You have to have law enforcement, and you have to have people who protect us from fire, and sanitation workers, and teachers to educate us, and doctors and healthcare workers, and all sorts of different small business owners, and other people in the society. And a lot of times in societies, there's a little bit of a criminal element. Now, think about what happens when there's an imbalance in a society. If you have a lot more of a criminal element than all these other roles, then that's when cities and towns and communities just fall to pieces. That's not good for anybody. But it's also not good if you don't have enough sanitation workers to pick up the trash and take it out. It's not good if you have too few law enforcement officials. It feels unsafe if you have maybe too many law enforcement officials. If they're too vigilant, that's a problem. You could have really good levels of a lot of different people in society all contributing, doing the things that they do. And if you don't have enough doctors and nurses, people suffer. It's a real consequence. I actually talk to people in a lot of different areas where they have a hard time getting in to a physician. Sometimes it's a specialist. I hear a lot of people say, wow, I really need to get into a neurologist because I'm having these symptoms and I need to get a proper diagnosis. But they're 6 months out. And that's not an exaggeration in a lot of cases. So a healthy society has to have a balance in all of these different roles. Too much of one thing, too little of something else, and we get into trouble. And you can think of all of the different microbes living in our gut as like a society. And there has to be a proper balance. When things are out of balance and we have too many bad bacteria that are proliferating, we get into real trouble. We have some serious health consequences as a result of that. And if we prioritize one type of good bacteria and we're feeding it really well, but we're neglecting other types, there can be some real negative consequences to that. Kind of like a society can have all sorts of people doing the right things, but if you don't have enough physicians and nurses, then people suffer. So, a well balanced microbiome is as important as a well balanced society. And I think it's a good analogy to think about it. Hippocrates, famous for being the father of what's known as the Hippocratic oath that doctors take, or at least used to take. Now they often take a different oath, but the Hippocratic oath comes from this physician from ancient Greece. And he famously said, all disease begins in the gut. I wonder if he knew how true that statement was. And for centuries, people were less aware of how much a role the gut plays in our overall health. But it seems like we're rediscovering evidence that maybe Hippocrates understood, at least from his observation. So let's talk about a few examples from more recent research that illustrates just how impactful the gut is. Take, for example, a study that was done a few years ago in mice. Mice are often used in research. And even though mice are not humans, there are enough genetic and other similarities that mice are a good place to start when it comes to researching things that might be affecting us as humans. And some researchers wanted to figure out how much the microbiome of an obese mouse might affect someone, or it might affect a mouse that is not obese. So they did an experiment and they took a fecal sample from an obese mouse and they transplanted it into a thin mouse. And in the thin mouse, they didn't change anything at all as far as dietary intake. There was exactly the same diet in that mouse before and after the fecal transplant. And yet, after the fecal transplant, the skinny mouse became obese. In other words, you could transfer obesity by transferring the bacteria in the gut from an obese mouse. That was a pretty staggering finding, and it caused people to really think differently about how important the gut is. What about anxiety? People have asked the same question about anxiety. Is it transmissible? How much of our gut health is playing a role in something like chronic anxiety. So researchers took rats and they studied their behavior, and they took a sample of fecal material from a human that had an anxiety disorder and introduced it into a rat specimen. And the rat had a significant change in behavior. They started to struggle to demonstrate pleasurable kinds of behavior, and they started to demonstrate more anxiety-like behaviors. And I'm not an expert in how you assess whether a rat is anxious or not. I'll leave that to the researchers that are studying this out. But there were significant changes in the neurobiology and the physiology of the rats. Increased plasma kynurenine and tryptophan ratio and kynurenine levels. There was an increase in bowel transit time. In other words, it took longer from the time the rat ate something until it came out the other end. And the trend was increased for body-wide inflammation. So there were really measurable changes in the rat after that fecal transplant from a human. Well, that was pretty amazing. And it caused a lot of researchers to start thinking, how does that affect us as humans? How much does the microbiome affect the way that we actually feel from day to day? In another study, a young mouse was compared to an aged mouse, and they took a young donor mouse and took a fecal sample and gave it to an aged mouse. And that aged mouse had changes that made it start behaving and even physiologically looking like it was a younger mouse. And they also have been able to take a fecal sample from an old mouse and give it to a young mouse, and the young mouse aged almost overnight. And they were able to see specific changes in various structures and aspects of physiology. That's pretty staggering. But what about in humans? What do we know in humans? Well, interestingly, there are some case studies. There hasn't been a ton of research on this, but there are case studies of Alzheimer's patients who developed C. diff, C. difficile infection, that is relatively common, especially in older adults that have used a lot of antibiotics. When you use a lot of antibiotics, sometimes this bacteria, known as C. diff, will start to proliferate. And it causes horrible diarrhea. It can be certainly life-threatening. And in a couple of situations, doctors treated an Alzheimer's patient who had C. diff with a fecal transplant, which is really the most effective way to treat C. diff. You take fecal material from a healthy human, put it in kind of a milk slurry, and then the physician does a transplant and introduces all of that good bacteria from a healthy person into the unhealthy ecosystem. And as a result of that, there was a massive improvement in their Alzheimer's symptoms, dramatic reduction in their dementia-related symptomology. And you see all of that in these couple of research studies that are outlined here. I should say case studies that are described. What about microbiota transfer therapy on autism symptoms? This is a paper from 2019 showing that a fecal transplant had a significant impact on the symptoms of youth with autism. So we're just now starting to scratch the surface at how much the bacteria that are living inside our gut play a real role in how we feel, how we function, how our brain health functions. And I wanted to jump in right at the beginning of this by giving you some examples of just how much the current research is suggesting that the health of our gut is affecting everything else. So let me introduce you to Dr. Jason Hawrelak, if you're not already familiar with him. Dr. Hawrelak is someone that I've been taking a class from. He prepared a lecture series that is hours long, and I've been spending a lot of time in the last couple of weeks going through this course, really digging deep, really trying to understand this. And it's kind of technical material. He talks about a lot of different strains of bacteria, and I'm not going to get into the weeds on all of that. What I've tried to do for our purposes today is to just go through at a high level and say, what are the key things that I've been learning from taking this course from Dr. Hawrelak? So I want to give him all the credit that he's owed. I am not an expert in the microbiome of the gut, certainly not anything like Dr. Hawrelak is. He has a lot of different degrees. He's a naturopathic doctor. He's a PhD researcher. He's a member of a lot of different professional societies. He's authored 20 textbook chapters. He spent 25 years treating people with IBS and ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease and gluten-related problems and chronic constipation and parasites and a lot of other things. And he's also spent over 20 years teaching at both the undergraduate level and the postgraduate level in multiple different university settings. And if you look at the list of academic papers that he's published, peer-reviewed research, it's a very, very long list. So he is one of the world's top experts in how the gut works. And he got fascinated in gut health as an undergraduate. So anything that I share with you has been inspired by the study that I've been doing with Dr. Hawrelak. So one of the first things that we can talk about that we could observe in ourselves to get a sense of how are things working in our own gut would be transit time and frequency. And transit time is how long does it take from the time food enters our mouth until it exits the other end, until we poop it out. And Dr. Hawrelak says ideally it should be 16 to 24 hours. And one of the easiest ways to tell what your transit time is, according to Dr. Hawrelak, is to eat corn on the cob or eat something like quinoa and then time yourself and see when that starts showing up in the toilet. I know that's not a pleasant thing to talk about, but this is a critical aspect of our health. And getting a sense of how long it takes for things to travel through the gut matters. As far as frequency, Dr. Hawrelak points out that a healthy gut should have us pooping 2 to 3 times every day. Now, a lot of people go once a day, but there are a shocking number of people that only go a few times a week. And surprisingly, the conventional medical world that is not an expert on the microbiome tends to say that constipation is defined as less than 3 bowel movements per week. And Dr. Hawrelak says that's a huge problem. So we've got a long way to go, in his opinion, to educate the physician community on what actually should be classed as constipation. So, what about the things that come out the other end? This is the Bristol Stool Chart. Many years ago, researchers went to Bristol, England, and they took poop samples from people all over that locale. And they started describing what they found. There were different types of stools that came out. And you see them here on the screen, type 1 up to type 8. And some people think that type 4, that's sausage and like a snake, it's very smooth and very soft and no cracks in it, is the perfect stool. And it is very healthy. But Dr. Hawrelak pointed out that type 3, type 4, and type 5 are all considered very normal. In fact, I learned from him that type 5 stools often occur in people that are eating kind of a whole food, plant-based sort of diet where they're getting a lot of vegetables, a lot of fiber into their system, they're hydrating really well. They might have sort of looser, softer stools 3 times a day that look like that type 5 kind of stool. And he said there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. That is not a sign of a real gut health problem. So take heart. If you have type 3, type 4, type 5 stools, according to Dr. Hawrelak, that's all normal. Now, some people have stools that are like little rocks coming out and they're very hard to pass, and they only pass them every few days. That is a sign of severe constipation. And obviously, the opposite end is not good. If things are just pouring out of us like liquid, that's a really significant problem, and we've got to figure it out and get on top of it. So, common gut symptoms show up as constipation and bloating and distension. If you eat and you feel like your stomach is just puffed out like a beach ball, that's a sign that you've got common gut health problems. So, these types of problems lead to what's called bowel toxemia. You've probably heard of leaky gut or leaky colon. A lot of people talk about it these days. It's when there are microscopic perforations in the bowel, little tiny holes, where particles of things that we're eating that the gut is trying to digest are leaking out into the bloodstream. And food particles cannot be processed in the bloodstream of the body. When they leak out there, our immune system recognizes them as foreign invaders and starts to make antibodies against them. And there's a lot of thinking now that that really drives autoimmunity. There's been a huge increase in autoimmune disorders in the last few decades. And an increasing number of researchers believe that's because too many people have a leaky gut and food particles are getting out into the bloodstream, and the immune system is making antibodies against those food particles and then attacking tissues of the body that have similar strings of amino acids as what you see in the proteins that make up those food particles. When you have bowel toxemia, you also have a lot more absorption of what are called endotoxins. Bacteria in the gut start breaking down fibers that didn't get digested earlier on in the digestive process. And when that happens, you get all of these negative end products that are toxic to the human system. They're really bad. And when you have a buildup of those endotoxins, you might have symptoms like chronic headaches and brain fog and fatigue. And sometimes people just feel really bad, like they're toxic. They just say, I just don't feel well. So let's explore some aspects of the microbiome itself. The human gut microbiota, this collection of all these bacteria, is estimated to contain 10 to the 14th power of living organisms, which means there might be as many as 10 times the number of bacteria in the gut as there are cells in the human body. Some researchers are saying we might be driven a lot more by the bacteria in our body than even by our genetics and by our own cells. So we have this symbiotic relationship where we have a bunch of bacteria that are living in our system. There's a microbiome in the gut, there's a microbiome on the skin, there's a separate microbiome in the armpits and in the oral cavity. We have all these bacterial colonies living, and we're learning that they have a lot to do with how our bodies function. There are estimated to be over 1,000 different species of bacteria in the gut. And one thing that comes up a lot in conversations about gut health is the term dysbiosis. So let's talk about what that is so that we have some terminology to work with here. Dysbiosis is defined by Dr. Hawrelak as a disturbance or imbalance in a biological system, such as changes in the types and number of bacteria in the gut. In other words, think about it like your town or city or community. If you don't have enough doctors and nurses, that's kind of the equivalent of dysbiosis in the gut. If you have way too many criminals and not enough people that are out there being good citizens, that's like dysbiosis. You have lots of bad bacteria that are proliferating, and you have very few good bacteria. That's a problem. So, different parts of our digestive system have different amounts of bacteria. And I'm not going to get too off in the weeds here. You don't need to understand all of the different types of bacteria that are found in parts of the system, but some of these you've probably heard of. Most people have heard of lactobacillus. Some people take lactobacillus supplements. And Dr. Hawrelak points out that in the stomach, in the duodenum, there are 10 to the first to 10 to the third colony forming units per milliliter of lactobacillus bacteria and streptococcus bacteria and various yeasts. But if you get to the jejunum and the ileum, you get a lot more bacterial colonies. And there's a lot more diversity as food passes lower on and gets further along in its transit through the gut. If you look at a chart like this that was created by Dr. Hawrelak, you start to get a sense of some of the complexities, and you start to almost have a picture of the society that exists in the gut. If you start having a real increase in Pseudomonas or Staphylococci or Clostridia or some of these really negative bacterial species, then you start to get a lot more hydrogen sulfide gas and all the consequences of that. You get a lot slower gut transit time. You get a lot more production of cancer-causing agents. And on the other hand, if you have a lot more good actors in the society of the gut, more like a lot of lactobacillus, or another one that some people have heard of is bifidobacteria. If you have a lot of lactobacillus and a lot of bifidobacteria, that's a good thing. That's kind of like, hey, you've got a lot of teachers and you've got a lot of firefighters and nurses and doctors and all of these different roles that help the society. There are a lot of benefits of having a healthy gut. We've now learned that the gut really modulates the immune system. In a lot of ways, you could say our immune response emanates from the gut. If you have a gut health problem, you likely have an immune system problem. So when the gut is healthy, it protects against allergy development. I'll give you a personal story on that. I developed hay fever as a child, and it was awful. It's the reason why when my parents gave me and my next youngest brother the opportunity to either do laundry for the family or mow the lawn, I chose to do the laundry. And it wasn't just because I knew that I could throw it in the washing machine and go do something else while it was running. And meanwhile, my brother would be out there sweating away mowing the lawn. The biggest factor in why I chose the laundry over the chore of mowing the lawn is that every time I was around cut grass or weeds or anything like that, my eyes would start to swell up, my nose would run like crazy. It was terrible for me. I lived on allergy medication for the first few decades of my life. But when I got serious about how I ate and I improved the health of my gut, my allergies went away. I honestly can't tell you the last time that I took allergy medication, and I used to take it every single day, year round, and not function well without it. I still sometimes get a little bit more puffiness in my eyes. I've never been able to really get rid of that, and I think some of that is a histamine response. But that's just something that I've lived with, and yet I haven't had other symptoms. My nose doesn't run like crazy like it used to. When the gut is healthy, it trains the immune system in a positive way. Normal gut motility also means that we're absorbing nutrients well. We have proper levels of B vitamins when the gut's working well. We have better levels of vitamin K that helps to deliver calcium to bones and teeth so that we can keep them healthy. We have better mineral absorption when we have a healthy gut. And interestingly, about 10% of our total energy production in the body is produced by the gut. Different bacteria will digest things that we can't digest as humans, but the bacteria can digest those fibers. And when bacteria do that, they produce a lot of short chain fatty acids and a lot of butyrate. And that can represent as much as 10% of our body's total energy requirement. A healthy gut is almost running itself from an energy production standpoint. And that becomes very important. A lot of times people will have chronic fatigue when they have a gut health problem. And part of that is because they're just not producing enough energy because they're not consuming the things that good bacteria in the gut need to be able to live on and digest in order to produce butyrate and short chain fatty acids and propionate and these other types of energy related byproducts. So all of this might lead to, okay, what causes dysbiosis? What causes the system to get really imbalanced? Well, one of the first things that Dr. Hawrelak talks about is a high protein diet in the absence of vegetables. So I don't want to scare anybody, but I want to just share what the research actually says. When you are breaking down protein, especially if you don't have a lot of vegetable fibers and fruit fibers in the system, then that protein breaks down and can be fermented by the microbiota. This is a process called putrefaction. If an animal dies out in the wild, it doesn't take very long before bacteria start breaking it down and it begins to stink terribly. And all of the tissues get really mushy. And I don't mean to be graphic here, but you've probably come upon a dead animal and just been turned away by how disgusting things are. And Dr. Hawrelak has pointed out that's basically what's happening in the gut if you're only eating a lot of protein, and it produces potentially harmful byproducts, cancer-causing kinds of byproducts, and things that cause other health problems. The more protein you eat, the more toxic byproducts you have. But the good news is eating fruits and vegetables with protein really decreases the production of those toxic byproducts. They're protective for the body. So we talk a lot here at A Mind for All Seasons about how important it is to eat enough protein so that we can maintain muscle mass. Because if we lose a lot of muscle mass as we age, that can be the difference between being able to get on and off the toilet or in and out of bed by ourselves or needing someone to assist us full time. So we don't want to lose muscle mass, but we also don't want to have dysbiosis. We don't want this imbalance of the bacterial colonies in the gut. So one of the ways through that is to be careful about the types of protein that we're consuming. A really good type of protein is fatty fish, like wild caught salmon. That doesn't cause so many of these toxic byproducts, and there's a lot of protein in it that can be used as building blocks for muscle. So, what else causes dysbiosis? Dr. Hawrelak points out a high fat diet in the absence of vegetables is a disaster for the gut. And it actually has been shown to increase the ratio of gram negative to gram positive kinds of bacteria. And there's an increased proportion of what are called lipopolysaccharide containing microbiota in the gut. In other words, there's a lot greater number of these toxic endotoxins, these byproducts from what the bacteria are breaking down that can damage us. There are also decreases in good bacteria, like bifidobacteria, and there are increases in E. coli populations. Most people know that E. coli is a really bad thing. Every now and then you hear about these E. coli outbreaks, and it might be with tainted lettuce or spinach, or it might be E. coli outbreaks with bad meat that's not cooked thoroughly, or things like that. Those same kinds of bacteria can start to proliferate more in the gut if you're eating a high fat diet without any vegetables. So Dr. Hawrelak has said, and I'm quoting him, a very low carb, high fat diet resulted in a significant reduction in bifidobacteria populations and a decrease in fecal short chain fatty acids and butyrate concentrations. So I put a picture on the screen to illustrate the differences here. If you're eating sausage and bacon and eggs, there's an advantage of that over eating breakfast cereal. The advantage is it doesn't provoke a significant insulin response. Having too much insulin in the blood is a serious problem. And so eating bacon and eggs will help to correct that problem. People will lose weight. They'll stay more in fat burning mode. And that's a really good thing. But there is a consequence to it because the society has to be in balance. You have to have all of the right kinds of actors in a community for it to work well. And in the microbiome of the gut, the exact same thing is true. And the consequence of eating a high protein, high fat, very low vegetable kind of diet for a long period of time is that you start losing bacterial colonies that you desperately need to have a healthy gut. So Dr. Hawrelak would encourage more the type of meal that you see on the right, where there's a lot of protein still. You've got eggs, you've got nuts, but you also have a lot of different plant fibers. This is also why Dr. Dale Bredesen, who many in our community have followed, you've read his books, that's why he talks about a diet that he developed called KetoFlex 12-3. A KetoFlex diet means you're prioritizing getting into ketosis because that's often helpful for people with Alzheimer's disease and other types of dementia. But you're doing it in a plant-forward manner. You're not just eating steak and eggs all the time. You're actually eating a lot of different plant fibers because Dr. Bredesen recognizes that that is what it takes to keep the gut microbiome healthy. And if we solve one problem, like too much insulin in the blood, at the detriment of our gut bacterial composition, then we might have short-term gains and long-term pains. So we need to do things in a thoughtful way. What if you need to be on a ketogenic diet? Well, I've already spoken to that just a little bit. You want to make sure that it's plant forward, that you're eating healthy fats like avocados and olives and extra virgin olive oil and nuts and seeds. Those nuts and seeds do a lot to feed the microbiome. But you might also benefit from using things like psyllium husk powder. There's a lot of fiber in things like psyllium husk powder, and that helps to keep sugars low, helps to provide greater blood sugar stability. It makes it easier to be in ketosis, and it allows to kind of offset some of the consequences of having a lot of protein and fat in the diet because a ketogenic diet is primarily a high fat diet. Most of the calories are coming from fat. What else causes dysbiosis? The standard American diet is notorious for causing gut health problems. And it's one of the reasons that we have so many gut health problems today. Standard diet that's loaded with ultra processed food, fast foods. It's very low in polyphenols, more on that to come. Low in total fiber. There's not a lot of diversity of different types of fiber. It's high in food additives. There's a lot of different chemicals that show up in fast foods and ultra processed foods that people eat in the US. And it's low in carbohydrates and polyphenols of the sort that gut microbes can use. So you're getting a high carb diet in the standard American diet. You're just not getting the right kinds of carbohydrates that the gut can actually benefit from. So you might be hearing all of this saying, great, now what? What do we do to optimize gut health? Dr. Hawrelak points out some really foundational things. So let's go through some of his recommendations. Number one is to avoid ultra processed foods because they have a lot of emulsifiers in them, and emulsifiers that allow for the mixing a lot of those ingredients in ultra processed food will break down and change the way that the gut works. It will change bacterial compositions and how they function, and they're very detrimental. So avoid those kinds of things. We need to eat a rainbow of different plant fibers. Some bacterial species live on a very narrow range of plant fibers. And not everything that we eat is for us. Some of what we eat is for the bacteria. We're eating for the zoo animals in the gut, Randy Vaudry has often said. And that's really true. So we need to eat the rainbow, lots of different types of fibers. We need to avoid problematic medications wherever possible. It's been shown that if you use an acid-reducing medication like Prilosec or Nexium or those sorts of things on a consistent basis, it is not good for the bacterial composition of the gut. And there are likely other things that are causing your symptoms. Sometimes people have acid reflux because they don't have enough stomach acid. Stomach acid is what makes the sphincter, where the esophagus connects to the stomach, actually close to prevent acid from splashing up into the esophagus. That's why some people that take apple cider shots with dinner don't have so much reflux, and they notice that things digest better. They are increasing the acidity of the stomach, and sometimes that is what helps people. Antibiotic usage is like dropping napalm in the forest, and I'm certainly not saying that there's no place for antibiotics. There are some conditions where you have to have an antibiotic or you might die, and it's appropriate to use it in a situation like that. But a lot of people go to the doctor and they beg for an antibiotic in a situation where maybe they have a virus. And sometimes doctors give in to that. And those antibiotics are not helpful if you're dealing with a virus. There are other things that you can do that might strengthen the system against a virus, but certainly not antibiotics. So let's not kill off good bacteria because now there's research showing that using even one round of antibiotics can have consequences for your gut health, sometimes years later. So it's not a decision to take lightly. Another thing that we can do to improve the microbiome is to spend time gardening. It's been shown that when individuals are out in the garden, they are exposed to a lot more microbes. The soil has a lot of microbes in it. And earlier generations of humans spent a lot of time outside getting dirty. Children played in the dirt. That was me when I was growing up. I was outside in the back field digging around and being exposed to all kinds of different things. And that is really good for the diversity of bacteria in the gut. It's like a society with all sorts of different people that are selling this craft or that product, and they just make society richer. And the same is true in the gut. When you're gardening, if you prioritize different types of manure compost, that has also been shown to increase the bacterial diversity in the gut, just because we're being exposed to those things. Eating a lot of fruits, vegetables, and nuts and seeds also ties in with the idea we talked about earlier of eating the rainbow. You don't have to eat a lot of everything. You need to eat a little bit of a lot of different things so that we're regularly feeding all of these different zoo animals, so to speak, living in the gut. We need to spend more time in nature. Part of that is for the same reason that gardening is effective. When you're out in nature, not only is it calming to the system, which is helpful for gut health, bad bacteria proliferate when we're just living in a constant state of anxiety and stress. And so getting out is a good thing. But we're also being exposed to a more diverse array of microbes when we're out in nature. Dr. Hawrelak points out that exercise can be good or bad for the microbiome. If you're exercising moderately and then you're having these short bursts of intense exercise, that's been shown to be extremely helpful for the human system. 1 minute of intense physical activity is equal to many dozens of minutes of light activity and 3 to 9 minutes of moderate activity. In other words, the heart will have more benefit from 1 minute of intensity than a lot of minutes of just walking around at a slow pace. So we do need to have these bursts of intense activity, but it's possible to overtrain. Good bacteria get a lot higher in concentration when you're exercising in the right way, but if you're overtraining, they actually decrease. It's too stressful for the body. So if you're going out and you are working out to the point of exhaustion constantly, it does not serve the gut microbiome very well at all. We can also eat fermented foods, kefir, which is a fermented milk product, or kimchi, or sauerkraut, or other types of fermented foods, pickles, or maybe sourdough bread. These types of things can temporarily increase the number of good bacteria in the gut. And if we're eating them regularly, then we're sort of pushing that level up on a consistent basis. We need to eat polyphenol-rich foods. Polyphenol is kind of a mouthful of a word, but it's just referring to the pigments that give different types of fruits and vegetables their characteristic color. There are different polyphenols that make blueberries blue and strawberries red, and that make yellow peppers yellow. And so we need to get all those different sorts of polyphenols because various types of bacteria feed on them. We need to eat resistant starch-rich foods. There are different types of resistant starches. And I won't spend a ton of time going to the weeds here, but resistant starch type 1 would be grains and seeds and legumes. And the highest number of these resistant starches in RS1 is things like buckwheat and sorghum and soaked oats. Resistant starch type 2 would be things like raw potatoes or plantains or unripe bananas. An unripe banana, even though it tastes kind of astringent and it's bitter, it's not anything like eating a really sweet, fully ripe banana. It actually has a lot of resistant starch in it, and that can provide a lot of blood sugar stability. It also makes a huge difference for bacteria colonies in the gut. But here's the catch. It has to be eaten raw. You cannot cook with it. Like you can't take green banana flour and make muffins out of it and have a good result. You're kind of destroying the whole idea of eating that resistant starch. Resistant starch 3 would be what's called retrograde starch. And this means you cook something like a potato or a sweet potato, and then you cool it down. You put it in the refrigerator and you don't eat it till the next day. There's a higher concentration of resistant starch that second day after you've cooked it. And the same can be true for different types of pasta or gluten-free pasta or rice or beans. The second day, there's more resistant starch in it. Another thing that we can do, according to Dr. Hawrelak, is to eat prebiotic-like foods. Now, a prebiotic is a fiber like inulin that the human body cannot digest, but the bacteria in the gut can digest. And those types of fibers are especially important to the bacteria. There are a lot of foods that have some of those types of ingredients in them, so they're considered prebiotic-like foods. And I have taken a chart here directly from Dr. Hawrelak. I did not create this. I want to give credit to him. He developed this, but he explains in this chart the specific effects on the bacteria in the gut from eating specific things, whether it's almonds or brown rice or blueberries. So let's say that you did a stool test and the result came that you did not have good concentrations of bifidobacteria. One way to increase that is to eat wild blueberries. That's been shown to have increased fecal concentrations of bifidobacteria. And you could go through a chart like this and see all sorts of different interventions. So here are a few more things, ranging from cocoa powder to pistachios, and what it will do if you eat that type of food. So pistachios, for example, will increase concentrations of butyrate producing species that have currently been uncharacterized, meaning there's still a lot of bacteria that haven't been named. Imaging techniques and research techniques and ways of identifying these bacteria have improved in the last few years. And so researchers are figuring out more and more different types of bacteria that exist that were previously unknown. It's kind of like discovering animal species in the Amazon rainforest that have never been discovered before. You can eat what are called FOS, inulin type fructans. These increase good bacteria. And here again, we get a chart from Dr. Hawrelak with types of foods that could be eaten and how much inulin type fructans is in the food, what a serving size would look like, what the dose of FOS is per serving. Now, why would you want to do some of those things? There's some interesting research. For example, there were some researchers that gave FOS in a supplement form to daycare age children. They were 4-month-olds to 24-month-olds. And they found that it resulted in a significant reduction in antibiotic use, 32% reduction in using antibiotics in these kids, 61% decrease in daycare absenteeism, 34% reduction in fever with cold symptoms, and a 61% decrease in episodes of fever in association with diarrhea. That's a pretty amazing outcome. And if you've got mom and dad both working and the kids have to go to daycare, and there's a dramatic reduction, like 61%, in how often the kids are absent from daycare, meaning one of the parents has to stay home with them because they're too sick to go to the daycare. That's a really big deal for a lot of people. And they're really just using a supplement like this. I just went online and looked for FOS powder supplements. This is the kind of thing that they were giving to these children. There was another study where they were giving similar types of supplemental fibers to children, and they found that toddlers had a significant reduction in the number of infectious diseases that required antibiotics, or fever, or diarrhea and vomiting. So, a couple of different research studies there that are showing some pretty significant results. One of the last things I'll share with you is the value of lactulose. Lactulose is semi-synthetic. It's made from fructose and galactose. Galactose is a sugar that's derived from milk. And lactulose is made when you put those two together. Interestingly, the United States is the only country where you have to have a prescription for lactulose, which doesn't mean that it's dangerous. It's actually kind of a legacy sort of thing. A long time ago, researchers didn't understand lactulose as well, and they said, well, you better have a prescription for it. Everywhere else in the world, you can just get it over the counter because it's viewed as very safe. It's commonly prescribed as a laxative, but it's also good at a lot of other things. It's good at reducing candida. In one model where researchers set up sort of it's like a fake gut. They weren't doing this in humans. They were setting up different containers basically where things would go through a process very similar to what happens in different parts of the gut. And they colonized them with different types of bacteria. And then they introduced a bunch of candida into it. And then they gave this sort of gut-like machine a lot of lactulose. And there was a 97% decrease in candida after introducing the lactulose. Dr. Hawrelak talked about using lactulose in some of his patients that have candida overgrowth and how really impactful that is in a very positive way. Conventional medicine uses lactulose to treat alcoholic liver disease. If people have problems with the liver related to alcohol intake, they can develop what's called hepatic encephalopathy. That's severe brain health problems because there's a serious liver problem. And lactulose is the primary treatment for that. If you go look it up online, you'll find, yeah, that's the first line therapy for this. And Dr. Hawrelak, in talking about it in the course that I was taking with him, kind of chuckled and said, most of the doctors don't understand what lactulose is doing in the gut and why it's so helpful. And if they understood the mechanism, they'd realize, oh, that's actually helpful in a lot of other conditions. It decreases endotoxin exposure and absorption, and it has healing effects in both the small and the large bowel. So there's a lot that can be done with lactulose to make a difference. Lastly, what if your bowels aren't moving? What if you're constipated? Well, the top three things to start with would be good fluid intake and exercise and fiber. Things like ground flaxseed is a really good place to start if your bowels are not moving very frequently, if you aren't having at least one good normal bowel movement every single day. Most people are chronically dehydrated in our world. That's the number one cause of fatigue in adults. And if you are not well hydrated by drinking somewhere around half your body weight in ounces, then the gut cannot work the way that it's supposed to. Exercise, especially when you're up walking around, is allowing gravity to do its work and to help things move through the gut. And that's a powerful way to help establish better bowel health. And fiber, of course, builds bulk, it keeps things moving through, and that might be really helpful. Some good sources of supplemental fiber include the ground flax seeds and slippery elm powder, or psyllium husks, or oat bran, or avocados, and some of the other things that you see here on this list. Now, in the end, I have an invitation for you. There is a lot more that we can talk about. Dr. Hawrelak in his course gets into very specifics about what if you have IBS, how exactly do you go about sorting through that and treating that? What if you have other gut health kinds of problems? What do you do about those things? I'll do that in a future masterclass. There's only time to do so much in one class, and only so many ways that I can summarize a several hours long course of study. But I'll end with a good next step for everybody, which is to try the Microbiome Diversity Challenge if you haven't already done that. On our membership site, there is a PDF document, and there's a small picture of it here on the screen. And it's colored, and it shows different types of foods that are those colors. And then it shows different days of the week. And all you do with this Microbiome Diversity Challenge is to make a tick mark every time you eat a food that falls into one of those categories. And there's certainly more foods than could be on the list, but it gives you a good idea of types of foods to be looking for. And the idea is to work up until you're eating 40 different types of plant fibers in an average week. That's a really good number to target. If you have 40 different types of fibers, you're covering a lot of different bases. And again, you don't have to eat a ton of everything. You just need to eat a little bit of a lot of different things. So if you've never tried this diversity challenge, I invite you to try it. And the other thing that you might attempt doing is to measure your transit time. Eat some corn on the cob or eat some quinoa and measure how long it takes before you start seeing the aftermath of that showing up in the toilet. And then come back and share what you learned and ask questions about it. I hope that this was valuable to you, and I appreciate you being here. And I look forward to seeing you again in a week for another masterclass.